it's been a year and a half since like the last nationwide lockdown happened. And since then, like COVID related disruptions have sort of dissipated. So there's a tendency to sort of think that it's in the past. But obviously, it's an unprecedented sort of shock, like COVID obviously leaves some of its scars, so to speak, behind. So obviously, I want to know just generally, what are the broad trends that you see in the Indian economy in this post-COVID period? And specifically, what trends do you see related to employment issues?
Yeah. So I think before I really speak about what happened post-COVID, I think it would also be nice to give just generally a short context on what was happening pre-COVID. So the whole issue, and specifically with regard to the labor market, what the Indian economy has been seeing over the last few decades is a contraction of the labor force, which is to say that people who are of working age and should ideally be employed are less and less likely to be employed. So our labor force has been generally contracting over time, which in itself does not, I mean, we can't say too much on it, but if you look at who are these, workers who are withdrawing, who are the workers who are not working, one major problem or sort of a flag is that it is the unemployed folks are the highly educated individuals. So you have this youth workforce particularly who have got, invested in human capital and got high levels of education. For some reason, they are remaining out of the workforce. So this in itself is not a healthy feature for an economy which is, sort of has been relying on a demographic dividend, as people have been calling it, right? So then when COVID, and on top of this, you also have particularly a high share of women not participating and a steady decline in women in the workforce. So on top of that, when COVID hit, you have some of these issues being exacerbated. So what we found was that it was the young workers in particular, people who were already in the labor market, but the only thing being that they were young and relatively less experienced, who were most hard hit because of the economic lockdown and the general contraction of the economy that ensued after the pandemic. So what has happened is that these workers have not been able to come back into employment, and we see similar effects for women as well. So you have these two major demographics, which are important constituents of the Indian population, who have been excluded from the growth process post-COVID. So even though we can say that to some extent the economy has recovered, there are sort of these excluded populations, so to speak.
All right. So talking about a little bit of about the excluded population, that one of the things that you worked on is and you've written about also is the gendered impact of the lockdown. Can you explain a little bit about how the lockdown and the pandemic affected women's employment differently than how they affected the male workers? Can you talk about that?
Yes. So what we did actually is that, what happened during the lockdown is that you have this huge number of workers being displaced from their employment, right? So what we actually did at the Center for Sustainable Employment was that we had pre-existing data of the workforce in the Indian economy, and this was from the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy's panel data. So by panel data, they are essentially tracking the same group of workers over a sustained period of time. So we had information of these workers before the pandemic or before the lockdown, but we were also able to collect the information during the lockdown as well as in the months after the lockdown. So what we really wanted to know is, well, if you were employed pre-pandemic, what happened to you during the lockdown? What happened to you in the months subsequently? And there, what we found was really quite shocking, and it was really stark. So what we found really was that one was that women were more likely to lose employment. So they were more susceptible to job loss. And second was that women were less likely to come back into employment in the months by the end of the year or in the months almost 6 months after the lockdown. So one thing that obviously that comes as well, it's because women were employed in high touch industries like health and education that were sort of disproportionately affected. It's because women are less educated, so that's why they tend to be more vulnerable to job loss. So what we did was, okay, let's control for all of these things, which is what we do. One of the strategies we do as economists, we do a regression analysis which controls for these kind of differences. And if you say, well, if you look at comparable men and women and you account for all of these differences in education and age and sector of employment, do these results still hold? And what we find again is that this actually is further substantiated even after controlling for all these things. So, in fact, what we find was that women were 7 times more likely to lose employment and 11 times more likely to not come back into work compared to men. So this is after controlling for occupation and sector specific differences. The other thing that we found also was that, you have things like experience, age, education holding men in good stead. So if you are highly educated, if you have greater experience, those kinds of men were more likely to come back into employment. But for women, education doesn't seem to hold them in good stead. So even if you are a highly educated woman, you are just as likely to not come back into work compared to an illiterate woman. So your education had really no standing in the labor market in terms of coming back to work. And also we find that like having children in the household, being married, these were things that were, pushing men into employment, whereas for women, they were things that were holding them away from employment. And finally, what we also found, well, what about the women who were able to stay back or who were able to return to employment, right? So one thing that emerged from the pandemic is that you have this fallback employment. A lot of people who had fairly secure, say, salaried employment have to move to some kind of informal work like self-employment. You start a little shop or you do some vegetable vendor on the roadside. So there's these kind of short-term informal strategies that men are likely to resort to. One, women don't have these kind of options in the sense that they're entirely pushed out of the labor market. But even for those women who do kind of stay on, their options in terms of negotiating and navigating the labor market are far fewer than what men have access to. So women are less likely to be in, say, self-employment and in fact more likely to be employed as daily wage workers, which typically is a kind of employment which pays far less than self-employment. So even for those women who were able to stay back, you find that even there's also this kind of squeezing out of opportunities for them.
So the title of your paper was Down and Out. And when I started reading it, I was like, okay, that's like a nice phrase, but it's literal in the sense that either you are pushed totally out of the workforce, or you're pushed downwards into the most, women are pushed down into the most precarious forms of employment. You mentioned that thing about like that women being kind of overrepresented be in the high touch industries like hospitality, and that not being a sufficient explanation for why they were not returned to the workforce. So obviously the question is, and maybe this is a little delving into a little more speculative because it's like difficult to quantify these things, but what are probably the reasons why this gendered impact was there on female employment?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of our work relies on secondary data. So, the kind of putting flesh on the bones of some of these results is difficult simply from that data alone. But of course, I think we can draw from a lot of anecdotal studies as well as other journalistic studies from women on the field, right? So one thing obviously is after the lockdown, even though things sort of eased, there was still a lot of mobility restrictions at work. So even just accessing work was difficult and I mean, of course, this is going to disproportionately affect women. But then I think the other big issue is care responsibilities. So, of course, schools had not reopened even well until I think a year after lockdowns. Schools still remained shut. And alongside that, childcare centers, Anganwadis had also not opened. So obviously, this meant that there need to be a caretaker at home for these children. And of course, that the caretaker is almost always the women, right? So women were almost always forced to stay back. But there was also, increased return of workers back to home. So a lot of migrants who may have left the household have now come back. So there's an additional care burden in terms of more mouths to feed, more household responsibilities for women as well. So all of these could also potentially have held women back. Of course, the fact that there is additional care burden and being in a larger household also holds women back. We have substantiated this using the secondary data. But in terms of, entry of return migrants, we don't really have evidence in terms of data. But of course, there's anecdotal evidence to suggest this. Yeah, so I think broadly it's the kind of restrictions around women's mobility, as well as the care burden that they had to um, face after that. That kind of explains largely the lack of return.
Um, can you talk a little bit about about what is the state of like younger women entering the workforce? Is it easier, or is that continuing to create a problem about for women to enter into the workplace rather than like older women dropping out? How easy or difficult is it for younger women to get into the workforce?
Yeah, so what we are finding is really that it is the younger women who are choosing to stay out. And what this manifests is that, of course, these younger women are also women who have higher levels of education compared with the earlier cohorts of women. So even though there is high levels of education, even though fertility rates have also declined, women are still not entering into the labor market. So there are several reasons for this. One is, of course, norms still continue, right? This whole idea, especially, as incomes increase in a household, there is this idea that when the woman in the household is working, it's an indicator of lower social status. And there's also this idea of kind of protecting women and maintaining their chastity, so to speak. And so them venturing out into work is seen as a negative indicator of social standing. So for many households, there is this idea that young women particularly need to be protected and not allowed to leave the house. So this could potentially explain why fewer young women are working. But then the other side of this is also the demand side, which is in terms of what are the kind of jobs available, right? So you have this pool of women who are highly educated, who've invested in their education. So of course, their reservation wage, which is the official jargon that we use in economics, which is, what is an acceptable wage that you will take that will sort of incentivize you to enter the labor market. So that reservation wage has now gone up for these women. If we don't get an amount above a certain level, it's not worth their while to participate, especially given that they have higher education, right? So the kind of good jobs that are available that meets women's reservation wage have not come about. So we've had this huge contraction of agriculture. Women have been kind of forced to withdraw. But on the other hand, the good jobs that should incentivize women to participate haven't really come about. The other thing, which is also less talked about, is that, and this is work by Farzana, Preeti, and others, which potentially, kind of suggests that when women have higher education, one is, of course, the reservation wage increases. It also makes sense for them to invest in their children's education. So they prefer to stay at home and invest their time on their children, given that they are also highly educated and they can participate in that kind of care of their child as well. So the reservation wage has to be quite high to incentivize these kind of highly educated women to participate. So there are these number of reasons, both in terms of high education of women and in inadequate, number of good jobs coming up, as well as social norms playing in keeping young women, particularly young women, out of the workforce.
Another area for research that really fascinated me is like the issues related to the actual measurement of female employment, and so in you compare these the two sources of employment data, the CMI private data, and then there's the PLFS data. And you found that in the greater part of the mismatch between the two surveys is resulting out of CMI kind of underestimating female workforce, labor force participation. Now, I find it fascinating because this kind of throws up all kinds of questions about how are the surveys conducted, what are the definitions that they are working on, who answers, who asks the questions, and who answers the questions. So can you talk a little bit about the difficulty in capturing female employment properly, and maybe what can be done to improve our estimation?
Yeah. So the whole debate around measuring women's work is something that has really engaged a lot of feminist economists over time. So I think if you trace the whole debate over a few decades, you can broadly classify these arguments into one, conceptual, and two, a statistical argument. So conceptually, what has happened is, and there has been some progress in the conceptual understanding of women's work over time. And really, this is the contribution of feminist leaders across the world. So one thing is that there's this expansion specifically in 2013. So there's this International Conference of Labor Statisticians, which come together to define, well, what should be included in national account statistics of definitions of employment and so on, and they kind of lay or prescribe these broad definitions. So in 2013, in the 19th conference of these statisticians, what was decided was, going away from this segmentation of the labor market into, or segmentation of activities into employment, unemployed, or out of the labor force. Typically, that's how you would understand activities. Either you're employed, or you're looking for work, which is you're unemployed, or you're inactive in a sense. Now they said, well, we need to move beyond this. And now what was introduced was really a difference between work and employment. So which is to say, and one way I can make this very clear is that all women are working, but not all of them are employed, right? It's clear what that means. Yeah. And a really nice nuance in this is to say, this is something that you discuss with students as well, that if a man marries his housekeeper, actually GDP goes down. I don't know if this is familiar, because a housekeeper prior to marriage is an employee, and in that sense employed, and so they contribute to the gross domestic product of the country. Now the moment he marries her, she's no longer an employee, although she continues to do everything she does, and GDP actually contracts, right? So now if you bring about this distinction of work and employment, work is essentially production of goods and services. Now this goods and services could be for yourself, or it could be for transacting in the market. The moment goods and services are produced for the market, that is what becomes employment, right? Now, where does the women's work and women's employment come in? One is conceptually, when women are doing a lot of work within the household, which was often for subsistence, that is, they produce goods and services for your own use. They might be growing, cultivating crops in their backyard or in their garden. They must be taking care of the livestock, which eventually goes into the family's meals, some output of that, right? Now, all of this is subsistence production, which doesn't go into employment, but it is actually work. So in that sense, conceptually, the idea of employment doesn't capture these kinds of important economic activities of the women. So that is the one broad conceptual mismatch or inadequacy in how women's work is being captured. So of course, this definition and clearing out, well, there's work and there's employment, does address this to some extent, because now you're saying, well, you also need to collect data on women's work as well. Collect data on employment, but you also need to collect data on women's work, which is not really done a lot, but it is something that can actually give us a better understanding of how women's energies are being spent. Now, the other aspect, which is the statistical part, is really, like what you had mentioned, is sometimes the way questions are being asked, and sometimes who the questions are being asked to, can also affect the measurement of work, right? So what we found, for instance, is that in our surveys, we had done a 2-state primary survey, of Karnataka and Rajasthan. And what we did in that survey was, every household that we visited, we interviewed a man and we interviewed a woman. And if this man and woman happened to be a husband-wife pair, we also asked them, well, tell us about your spouse's activities. And of course, these interviews were conducted in private, so they really didn't know what the other person was saying. So the one thing that we found was, when you ask men to report about women's employment, right? So they're saying, well, does your wife work, or is your wife employed? They're likely to underestimate women's work. So it actually an underestimation by the extent of 6 percentage points. So men are less likely to identify women as working compared to the women themselves, right? And you don't see this underestimation when you ask women to report about their husbands, right? And the second thing is that we also found, well, does it matter what is being asked? So this is what we did was, so typically what a labor market survey, or how does it capture? It goes to a household, it usually speaks to the household head or whoever's available at that time. And they ask them, what was the major activity of this person in either the last week or the last year, right? So it's a single question asked about what they primarily did. Now, when you ask like this, you get actually very low employment estimates for women. So what we did differently was that instead of asking a single overarching question, we called out each kinds of activities. So we said, were you helping in the family farm or the family business in the last week? Did you work for pay or profit in some kind of self-employment activity in the last week? Did you work for wage or salary in the last week, right? So we've called out different kinds of activities. And it was interesting that just that simple calling out of activities actually improves women's employment rate by 16 percentage points, right? And so what this comes from, both the who is being asked and what is being asked, what it actually points towards is that there's a primary identity which is associated with women, which is that they are homemakers or they are helping in the household, right? The identity of women as workers and as employed people is often not recognized, not just by men, but also by women themselves. So if you just ask a woman, what did you do last week? She's going to say, oh, I was just helping out in the house. But actually, when you call out different activities, they're more likely to then actually say, oh yeah, I did contribute to this. And you will find that women are engaged in a lot of activities which are economically remunerated, right? So there is the statistical sort of inadequacy where, just the way we are asking questions, who we are asking it to, often also misses out many kinds of productive and economic activities that women undertake in. And so you have huge variation across surveys in India. So you have CMIA giving women's WPR at 8%. You have the PLFS giving it around 20%. And our survey for the same states, for similar areas, also gives us estimates of 40%. So that's the range. You're going from 8 to 40. And the difference is basically how the question is being asked, the training of enumerators, who it is being asked to.
What kind of, in this direction only, like what kind of future work are you planning on doing, or other people who are working on these similar problems? What direction does it need to take so that we move like from this gray area of the range from 8 to 40 to some kind of like a broad consensus or a greater, better estimation of female employment? What needs to be like worked into?
Right. So I think one is, I think more studies in this direction, which can then push our official government estimates to incorporate better questions. Sometimes it's not feasible to speak to women directly. So maybe that's not something that's practical. But of course, it's nice to have this caveat at the back of any survey. Well, there is potentially likely to be an underestimate. But it's easy enough to add a few more questions asking about, well, did you do other things too, right? And so one is pushing more work in this direction to kind of substantiate these points. Two, also having more surveys running on the side, which are kind of, so right now we have a yearly periodic labor force survey, but there needs to be other sort of supplementary surveys that look at, say, time use of women, or what are the kind of informal activities that they take place, that they participate in, what is the kind of care burden that they have. So there is also need to kind of build some more evidence around these areas, which can come through other kind of supplementary primary surveys that are there. But there's also a lot of administrative data, which unfortunately is not really looked at enough. That can also give a wealth of evidence. So like the NREGA MIS can also tell us some kind of information on, are women participating and what are the kinds of work that they do? Is there some seasonality? How does this match up with other official estimates and so on? So kind of triangulating across various data sets and also supplementing that with other surveys is also important.
There is this mismatch between PLFS and CMI, but as far as I understand, the overall trend of female workforce participation is downwards, right? It is pointing in a similar direction. So I guess the question is, like, I guess now we can talk about like what to do about things. So what do you, like, at a policy level, at the government level, like what can be done to arrest this like downward trajectory?
Yeah, so one thing is that I would say that in the more recent PLFS, there's been some slight uptick in women's WPR, and I will come to what that means later when I
Okay.
respond to this.
Okay.
But broadly, in terms of policy, see, one of the major reasons why women have withdrawn is this contraction of agriculture, right? So but there are still a large section of our women workforce remains in agriculture.
Yes.
So there is also need for kind of focused policies that can improve productivity in agriculture. This could be better techniques, but also linking the agricultural market with the other sort of demanders of agricultural produce, which basically policies that can enhance agricultural productivity, which can then also feed back into women's earnings within agriculture, right? But also the other thing, and this for me is most important, is where women have kind of benefited from employment really is when employment is in manufacturing and is in the form of salaried work. And so that is where our manufacturing sector really comes to play a huge role, right? So manufacturing sector is the sector that can potentially create huge numbers of salaried wage workers. And there is a need for policy that specifically addresses women's employment. This could come in the form of wage subsidies. So during COVID, for example, we had this kind of an implicit wage subsidy coming in where the government said a certain proportion of the employer provident fund, which was being paid typically by an employer, the government would pay that expense. Now, tweaking this so that you can say, well, if you're employing a woman, then the government will pay that, right? So that is one way in which you can create wage work for women. Then on the other hand, if you look at self-employment, which is another major employer, kind of employment that women are engaged in, this is the kind of work that is really quite it's susceptible to a whole lot of biases. So as a self-employed individual, you're often interacting with an input market, with a credit market, as well as an output market, right? And in all of these markets, women face disproportionate burdens compared to men. So again, here you need sort of specific credit, which is focused towards women. You need digital technologies which are focused towards women. And so there you need far more nuanced policy which addresses each of these biases in the various markets that they interact with. But broadly, I do feel that the kind of transformative power lies in wage work. And I have broadly two reasons for this. One is, if you look at wage work compared to self-employment, wage work is the kind of employment where women are able to go out of the house, they are meeting other people, they improve their social networks, they also get their wages in hand or in their account, right? As against self-employment, where sometimes this employment remains cooped up within the household, their kind of ownership and access to resources is still limited. So just in terms of from an empowerment sense, I think wage employment is far more transformative than self-employment. And the second reason is, even in terms of earnings, if you look at what is wage employment and what is self-employment, you find that wage employment, if you look at women who are the top earning wage workers, right, there is no male-female gap. They are earning as much as men do. But if you look at self-employment, if you look at the top earning men and the top earning women in self-employment, the earnings gap still remains because of, like I discussed, all of these biases that women are confronted with as self-employed. So I do think that in terms of closing the earnings gap as well as the employment gap, wage work is what has a transformative potential, and that is where policy should focus on.
All right. You mentioned something about like the uptick in recent times when can you just talk about that?
Yeah, so what we see with the PLFS is there is some increase in women's workforce participation by about 1 or 2 percentage points post-COVID, right? Now, is this a good thing? Well, if you look at the kind of work, where is this increase coming from? This is an increase in self-employment of women, and not just self-employment means you are running a family farm or you run the business, right? But it's not that kind of self-employment. This is a particular kind of self-employment which is known as unpaid family work or contributing family worker, which means that you just you work in the family farm or business, you're not kind of getting a salary or you're not getting a profit directly from that. You share in that profit in some way, but you may not actually get it in hand, right? Now, if you think about it, this is not really the kind of employment ideally you would want women to be in. And so what this is pointing towards is that this is some kind of distress employment. You've had this huge shock on family budgets. Women are forced to now engage and kind of, bring in some kind of income. So they are working with a family farm or enterprise. So this is another thing, similar thing that you find actually in 2004-5, between 1999 and 2004-5. There too, you see an increase in women's employment rate. But then if you look at this was a time when this was a drought period in the Indian economy. And women were then forced to enter as sort of added workers to supplement family incomes. So sometimes women's employment is actually a counter-cyclical phenomenon. So when, the economy is dropping, that's when you'll find the employment rate increase. So I think it also is important to be cautious about how you interpret employment rates, particularly in a developing country context. The employment rate may not be a adequate measure of the health of the labor market. You may need to look at other things on what is the kind of employment being created. Is it just more and more women in distress employment? Well, that doesn't mean that a higher employment rate is a good thing.